few years back, I was having coffee with a European diplomat in Washington. We were discussing global tensions, the usual talk of great power competition, the rising challenge from China. He was polished, articulate, mapping it all out like a chessboard. Then, almost as an afterthought, he sighed and said something that stuck with me. "The problem with your country now," he said, "is that it feels like it's arguing with itself about what it even is, while the rest of us are waiting for it to show up to the meeting." Don't. I thought of him last week, reading the new 33-page Trump 2025 National Security Strategy. Because here's the thing that makes no sense at first glance. In a document meant to confront America's greatest global rivals, Russia and China are barely mentioned. Instead, page after page is devoted to a startling, almost surgical critique of America's oldest allies in Europe. The report doesn't just criticize their policies. It diagnoses a civilizational sickness. It warns that Europe's immigration is changing the continent, that it faces speech censorship, a collapse of birth rates, and a loss of national identity. The stark conclusion. Unless Europe elects more nationalist, patriotic parties to stop migrants, its civilization could vanish within 2 decades. Let that sink in. A U.S. national security strategy effectively telling Europe, your democracy is less important to us than your demographic purity. This isn't a footnote. This is the core of the document. And in that glaring, bizarre focus, ignoring the dragons at the gate to lecture your friends about their family problems, I saw the unmistakable silhouette of an elephant flying. It reveals a profound and unsettling truth. This isn't a blueprint for a new Cold War abroad. It's a manifesto for a new civil war at home. A war over a single burning question. Who does this home actually belong to?
Okay, wow. Let's unpack this. Because what you've identified there, that's not just a small policy change. This national security strategy, this NSS, it represents a truly revolutionary break in American foreign policy.
Revolutionary is the word.
It really is. It doesn't just tweak the system. It completely obliterates the post-Cold War consensus that has defined, the transatlantic relationship for over 70 years.
A consensus built on mutual defense, democratic values.
Exactly. Mutual defense, expanding democracy, deep economic integration through trade. This document just throws all of it out. So today, we're going to dive deep into what this massive strategic shift, this move from, traditional geopolitical threats to this intense focus on internal, cultural, and demographic preservation, what it reveals about the forces driving right-wing populism in the West.
And here's where it gets really interesting for our deep dive today. We're going to explore those connections between, the cold facts of economic anxiety and these deeply felt cultural grievances, and critically, how those anxieties are strategically leveraged.
Using these narratives.
Exactly. Narratives like the great replacement to completely redefine what Western civilization even means. We'll look at the specific psychological pathways, and this is all rooted in some really fascinating empirical research, that turn a simple worry about losing your job into a fervent anti-immigrant sentiment.
And how that process ultimately shapes something as high level as national security doctrine.
That's the leap. This NSS, when you look at it this way, is the physical manifestation of a domestic cultural war being projected onto the global stage. It makes the debate over American identity the ultimate foreign policy challenge.
Okay, so let's start by deciding this seismic shift in policy. The NSS of a second Trump administration, which would come out around late 2025, is explicitly built around 2 new core intellectual pillars. They call them civilizational realism and hard sovereignty.
I hear those terms, but how do we actually define them for our deep dive? They sound academic, but the implications are so practical, so real world.
They really are, and they're the theoretical justification for this complete break with the past. Hard sovereignty is probably the easier one to get your head around first.
Okay.
It means the United States defines itself primarily as a singular sovereign republic. Its survival is its only goal, full stop.
So it's an America First doctrine, but with a philosophical backbone.
Exactly. It emphasizes the nation-state as the only legitimate political unit and rejects any supranational obligations.
So things like the World Trade Organization, certain UN treaties.
Even the institutional obligations within NATO. It's an intellectual rejection of global governance, in its entirety.
Okay, so that's hard sovereignty rejecting the global system. What on earth is civilizational realism? That sounds new.
That's the truly novel and frankly unsettling pillar. Traditional realism in foreign policy, it focuses on power dynamics between states, who has the biggest army, the strongest economy, that sort of thing.
Right, the classic chessboard.
Yes.
Yeah.
But civilizational realism introduces a totally new metric: cultural and demographic preservation.
Wow.
It argues that the greatest long-term threat to the U.S. isn't a foreign army crossing a border. It's the internal dissolution of Western culture and identity.
So foreign policy becomes an extension of a domestic culture war.
That's it, precisely. Therefore, American foreign policy must prioritize the survival of the U.S. and, by extension, what it deems culturally compatible European nations from these perceived internal threats like mass migration and the progressive political forces that supposedly enable it.
That is a stunning intellectual leap. So you're saying this NSS completely obliterates that core consensus, the very idea of global leadership through alliances, trade, promoting democratic values that the U.S. itself built after World War II.
It does, completely. Where previous strategies were all about active global leadership, this one focuses intensely inward. It basically views the rest of the world as a potential threat to America's internal cultural stability.
And the consequence of that inward focus is this dramatic marginalization of what we've always called geopolitical threats, which brings us to that bizarre part of the opening. Russia and China are barely mentioned in the core strategic argument. I mean, how is that even possible in a 2025 national security strategy?
Well, China is still identified as the primary rival, but look at how it's defined. The competition is framed almost entirely as economic, not ideological.
So it's not about democracy versus authoritarianism anymore.
Not at all. The NSS codifies economic nationalism as a core security component. It rejects decades of bipartisan consensus on globalism and free trade. We see a commitment to imposing a universal baseline tariff of, 10% on all imports?
Which would be a massive economic disruption.
A huge disruption, with even higher punitive tariffs on countries with big trade surpluses with the U.S. The challenge from China is seen through the lens of supply chains, trade imbalances, IP theft, not as a threat to democracy or a competing model for the world.
It just transforms the entire great power competition into a giant trade war.
It does.
And the treatment of our closest allies, especially in Europe, is just, it's unprecedented in any U.S. strategic document I've ever seen.
Absolutely. They're not just criticized for trade, they are explicitly deprioritized for defense.
Even with the threat from Russia still very real, especially concerning Ukraine.
The document is crystal clear on that. NATO expansion is halted. Specifically for Ukraine, which, aligns very neatly with Russian demands.
This is a direct concession.
You could see it that way. And it explicitly says Europe is expected to handle its own security. The whole strategy is just so transactional. Look at Africa, for instance.
Right. Africa. If I remember correctly, it's relegated to, half a page at the very end of this 33-page document.
That's right, a half-page afterthought. And the treatment is purely transactional. It effectively ends the era of nation-building, democracy promotion, any kind of human rights conditionality.
So the U.S. will just accept leaders and nations as they are.
As they are. That's the phrase. This means prioritizing stability and resource security over any pretense of political reform. It even means accepting authoritarian partners if it serves U.S. interests.
So Africa isn't seen as a place for human development or economic development for its own sake.
Not at all. It's viewed purely as a battleground for resource competition with China. The focus is laser sharp.
On critical minerals.
Critical minerals, things essential for the energy transition and our defense industrial base: cobalt, lithium, rare earths. The NSS says it will support big infrastructure projects, like the Libido Corridor Railway,
which is designed to get minerals out of the DRC and Zambia.
And, critically, to bypass Chinese-built routes, ensuring American access. Any effort to resolve conflicts, say the civil war in Sudan, is only undertaken to get the stability needed for resource extraction.
Not for the political or social development of the continent.
No. It's treating an entire continent as nothing more than a resource base. It really solidifies Africa's status as the absolute lowest priority in American strategic thinking.
But, as we said at the top, the real target, the one that generates this genuine ideological heat in the document, is Europe itself. The NSS effectively declares war on the political establishment of our closest allies.
It's a stunning piece of political commentary disguised as national security strategy. It starts by saying Europe remains strategically and culturally vital to the United States, which sounds, fine.
It sounds positive, yeah.
But then comes the diagnosis. Europe, the NSS asserts, is facing the stark prospect of civilizational erasure.
That term, civilizational erasure, that's the tell, isn't it? It immediately signals the ideological shift and connects this official foreign policy document directly to that far-right domestic rhetoric we were talking about.
It's a direct link. But the NSS doesn't just blame external enemies. The culprits it identifies are within Europe.
So who are they?
The document blames the European Union and, I'm quoting here, other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty, alongside mass migration and what it calls the suppression of political opposition.
And that suppression part is wild. In a striking passage, the NSS frames European efforts to legally prevent, say, anti-Semitic hate speech or Germany's ban on pro-Nazi parties as an affront to the United States and a constraint on speech.
Wait. The U.S. national security strategy is criticizing key NATO allies for their hate speech laws.
That's what it says.
That sounds like the U.S. exporting its own domestic culture wars about free speech versus censorship directly into the European legal framework.
That's precisely the implication. And it moves way beyond criticism. It explicitly calls for a revival of European nationalism.
How so?
The NSS demands unapologetic celebrations of European nations' individual character and history. And even more strikingly, it explicitly endorses the far-right nationalist and patriotic European parties that have emerged over the last decade. It says their growing influence gives cause for great optimism.
That's not just an endorsement. That sounds like a call to action. It's demanding the U.S. actively intervene in European democratic politics, prioritizing cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory. That is a truly dramatic and alarming shift.
It is the ultimate reversal of 70 years of American foreign policy. I mean, think about it. After World War II, the U.S., led by people like President Eisenhower, was the strongest advocate for European integration.
Right, for the creation of the EEC.
Exactly. And the whole point was to suppress the destabilizing nationalism that had caused 2 world wars. Eisenhower said uniting Europe was about winning the peace. This NSS explicitly seeks to dismantle that very structure by promoting the nationalism the U.S. worked for decades to contain.
So let's get practical. How is the U.S. directed to intervene? This can't just be rhetorical support.
No, it's not. The NSS suggests several potential mechanisms for intervention. It starts with money and soft power.
Okay.
First, the administration plans to use funding cuts from traditional global democracy budgets. Specifically, they'd eliminate the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and make huge cuts to the State Department's democracy programs.
And that frees up funds.
It frees up funds that can then be reprogrammed to support far-right parties and activist groups in Europe that align with the NSS's patriotic vision.
So instead of funding civil society groups that promote, transparency or human rights, these funds get rerouted to support groups that mirror the NSS ideology, even if those groups are on the political fringes in Europe.
That's the danger, yes. In countries with strict campaign finance laws, even a small amount of dark money or support channeled through nonprofits can have a huge impact. You're essentially conducting overtly political operations aimed against the sit-in governments of your own allies.
It's basically taking Russia's tactic of supporting far-right parties and making it official, explicit U.S. policy.
And what about the technology angle? How does the NSS leverage American tech against European regulatory efforts?
U.S. tech companies, with the backing of the NSS, are directed to actively resist or ignore European tech regulation, especially around content moderation and hate speech.
Which the NSS frames as reversing constraints on speech.
Exactly. The administration would use the American concept of free speech to promote far-right content that transnational bodies in Europe are trying to restrict. It provides a massive, unregulated platform for the narratives the NSS favors.
So by using American economic and technological power, the NSS is essentially trying to normalize the very cultural and demographic anxieties that fuel its own ideology, but inside Europe.
Precisely. And the final point of intervention is the use of the intelligence community.
That's chilling.
The document raises the question of whether U.S. intelligence resources will be deployed to support these favored movements. It mirrors tactics from the early Cold War used to support anti-communist movements in Italy or France. For sovereign allies, this is an alarming proposition. It suggests a level of interference you'd normally reserve for adversaries.
And if the ideological pressure doesn't work, there are financial threats designed to dismantle the alliance itself. Let's talk about that NATO requirement.
The NSS warns that nations like Germany or Belgium, these are founding members of NATO, could lose their Article 5 protection.
The Mutual Defense Clause, the heart of the alliance.
The very heart of NATO. And they could lose it if they fail to meet an unprecedented 5% of GDP defense spending target.
5%. To put that in context, the existing target that allies are already struggling to meet is 2% of GDP. 5% is historically massive.
It's about 1.5 percentage points higher than what the U.S. itself spends on defense as a percentage of GDP during peacetime. It's a metric that is designed to be impossible for most European social democracies to meet without gutting their welfare states.
So it's not a real target.
It's a political weapon. It provides a guaranteed, pre-written justification for the U.S. to unilaterally pull back on its commitments and fracture the alliance. The strategy implicitly seeks the downfall of most center-right and center-left European leaders who currently lead the EU and who would, naturally oppose this nationalist trajectory.
Okay, we have to turn now to the underlying ideology that makes this all tick. We identified that term, civilizational erasure, as the core ideological marker. We really need to define how this rhetoric, which flows from the fringes, has become mainstream enough to inform a national security doctrine.
Right. The NSS's language is a direct echo of the Great Replacement Theory, or GRT. It's the ideological bedrock of nativist movements across the West. What's so fascinating here is how a fringe and often violent conspiracy theory has climbed the ladder to inform an official U.S. policy document.
So let's define GRT clearly for everyone. What is the core argument?
The GRT argues that white European populations are being deliberately and systematically replaced, both ethnically and culturally, through mass migration and the growth of minority communities.
And the focus isn't just on, general population shifts. It's on a coordinated, malicious plot.
A plot, that's the key word. And the targets are highly specific.
Right.
Proponents of this theory often single out Muslims, viewing them as a religious and ethnic group that is fundamentally, culturally incompatible with Western life.
And this evolved from earlier fears, right?
It did. It evolved from earlier, less conspiratorial fears among counter-jihadists about the Islamization of Europe. But since around 2011, the theory popularized by the French writer Renaud Camus, it's become far more severe. It emphasizes the complete orchestrated replacement of white people.
And this is the key distinction, isn't it? It moves from simple xenophobia, a fear of foreigners, to a full-blown conspiracy theory about deliberate destruction orchestrated by some kind of elite.
Precisely. The proponents amplify their message by suggesting that progressive politicians, the mainstream media, and so-called globalists are all purposefully working together to destroy native Europeans and their cultures.
And this is where the theory layers on these deeply disturbing anti-Semitic narratives.
It does. Tell us more about that connection.
The theory is frequently overlaid with anti-Semitic tropes, specifically blaming globalist Jewish elites for mass migration. They often reference something called the Kalergi Plan.
The Kalergi Plan.
It suggests a decades-old conspiracy, supposedly originating with an Austrian politician, to intentionally change the ethnic makeup of Europe and America.
Okay.
So this isn't just prejudice. It's a specific codified conspiracy narrative used to demonize a group of elites who are allegedly orchestrating this societal collapse.
And that shift from just general change to an existential conspiracy, that explains the extreme urgency and the potential for violence we see associated with the theory. If you genuinely believe your entire culture is being deliberately destroyed, you feel compelled to act.
That sense of existential threat is the necessary psychological precondition for these extreme solutions. It necessitates immediate radical action. We know this theory has been tied to recent terrorist acts.
The shootings in New Zealand.
And at synagogues in the U.S., all framed by the perpetrators as necessary resistance against the replacement.
And the rhetoric goes straight to policy, often through this concept of remigration.
Remigration. It's a chilling euphemism, isn't it? Championed by identitarian groups like Generation Identity. It's a sanitized term for the forced repatriation of migrant communities.
It's essentially a form of nonviolent ethnic cleansing of Europe.
Yes. And we've seen these groups stage highly publicized stunts like defend Europe, chartering vessels to prevent refugees from reaching European soil, framing these actions as necessary resistance.
But is this rhetoric just confined to fringe groups and online echo chambers, or is it genuinely widespread?
The calls for extreme action are depressingly widespread. For instance, an analysis of British anti-Muslim tweets found that a significant portion, about 5% of those messages, contained an explicit call to ban Islam or deport Muslims.
So the urgency of the replacement narrative is driving immediate radical calls for policy action among its followers.
And we know this movement has successfully used the digital landscape to jump from the fringes into the political mainstream.
Oh, the movement has scale. A 2019 census of official identitarian accounts found tens of thousands of followers across platforms YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. They are incredibly adept at using technology.
They leverage what are called dark social platforms, right?
Right.
Like Telegram.
Exactly, places that are difficult to moderate. and ultra-libertarian platforms like Gab, which tolerate extremist content in the name of absolute free speech. This provides a safe haven for radicalization while they push sanitized, less violent versions of their message into the mainstream.
And this movement has successfully infiltrated established politics.
We see politicians in Europe making explicit or, barely veiled references. Figures like H.C. Strauss in Austria, Marion Maréchal Le Pen in France.
And Bjorn Höcke of the AfD in Germany, who warned of the impeding death of the people through Great Replacement.
And entire political parties are internalizing the vocabulary. The AfD, the FPÖ in Austria, for example, have picked up remigration as an official policy solution in their manifestos.
And even when mainstream politicians don't use the exact phrase Great Replacement, they use closely mirroring language. They refer to migrants as invaders.
That language is a deliberate strategy. It legitimizes the underlying theory without explicitly endorsing the conspiracy component.
President Trump has frequently used the term invaders.
He has, and he's implicitly humored the narrative of white genocide in South Africa. He's retweeted accounts promoting white genocide theory. This incremental mainstreaming validates the extremist worldview.
The polling data after major populist shocks like Brexit and the 2016 U.S. election certainly suggests this theory has penetrated deep into the voting base.
Absolutely. Survey data after the Brexit referendum showed that 30% of Leave voters explicitly believed in the Great Replacement theory.
30%? Compared
to only 6% of Remain voters. The differential is massive. Both Brexit and Trump voters consistently showed a much higher tendency to believe in these kinds of conspiracy theories related to immigration. It shows that successful populist movements can build significant support by normalizing these dangerous extremist talking points.
And the alternative media ecosystem plays a massive necessary role in this normalization process.
It's crucial. Alternative far-right media outlets are responsible for roughly half of the total coverage of a term like remigration in certain periods. They combine misinformation, conspiracy theories, and hyper-partisan commentary to reinforce the worldview. They use YouTube and Twitter to get the message out while relying on fringe platforms as their safe havens. This blend of fringe ideology and political endorsement is the critical pathway that allows a concept like civilizational erasure to land in an official NSS document. Okay, so now we need to move from the ideology itself to the underlying causes. I mean, how does real economic hardship morph into this potent cultural grievance? As you pointed out earlier, the debate over whether populism is rooted in economics or culture, it's often framed as a false dichotomy.
It's such an important clarification. The research really suggests that economic shocks don't just happen in a vacuum and create purely financial worry. They work through cultural and identity channels, and it's that conversion process that heightens populist support.
That's the core finding. Globalization shocks, whether from trade, migration, or financial crises, they cause real economic dislocation. But this dislocation then influences political outcomes via these specific mechanisms. And we're really interested in the demand side, how voters' preferences are changed by these shocks.
So let's look at the automation pathway. That's a key economic shock driving this. The research here uses experimental data to really isolate the effect. Can you tell us more about how this specific threat of job displacement influences political preference?
Sure. So researchers studied exposure to automation risk, and this covered everything from displacement by industrial robots impacting manufacturing workers all the way to AI impacting white-collar professionals. They wanted to know if the mere threat of a robot taking your job creates specific non-economic grievances.
And what did they find? What exactly are those grievances?
The displacement risk doesn't just increase job anxiety. It significantly triggers two specific identifiable cultural grievances: increased nostalgia and increased perceived marginalization.
Okay, define those for us.
Nostalgia here means a sentimentality for the past, along with the belief that, American identity has been lost or corrupted, and marginalization is that feeling of exclusion, of being disrespected or poorly treated by society, that feeling of my values are no longer respected in this country.
So if I understand this correctly, the economic threat of displacement, say a robot getting installed on the assembly line, that translates directly into a cultural anxiety that my identity as an American is being lost, or that my traditional way of life is under threat.
That is the profound link. And this anxiety, in turn, makes workers predisposed to back right-wing populist candidates who promote illiberal policies.
Specifically trade protectionism and anti-immigration measures.
Exactly. They aren't just looking for a new job, they're looking for the restoration of a specific cultural status they feel they've lost.
And the research was so specific that it differentiated between types of technological threats, didn't it?
It was incredibly nuanced. Exposure to news about automation risk generally increased opposition to trade and immigration. But, and this is the key part, the anti-immigration effect was significantly stronger after news that robots were replacing manufacturing jobs compared to news about AI displacement affecting white-collar roles.
Why would that differentiation exist? That's a remarkable level of specificity in the response.
It points directly to the intersection of economic anxiety and perceived cultural competition. Manufacturing workers might see industrial robots as a direct, powerful metaphor for, or even a proxy for, competition with low-skilled immigrants for the remaining jobs. The replacement is happening in a job category traditionally susceptible to that kind of labor competition.
Whereas the AI displacement, being about high-skilled white-collar labor, provokes less of that specific anti-immigration response because the identity of the perceived competitor is different.
Exactly. The grievance is less about being replaced by a foreign worker and more about a broader systemic change.
That research establishes a strong link, but the real smoking gun is the experimental evidence on the causal mechanism itself, proving that cultural anxiety actually causes the political shift, rather than just being correlated with it.
This is the crucial finding. The study included an element where subjects were randomly prompted to do a reflective writing task. It was an autobiographical memory task designed specifically to actively encourage these cultural grievances, either nostalgia or marginalization.
And they weren't given any economic information.
None at all. They were simply primed to feel culturally anxious.
So what happened in the groups that were primed?
The results were striking. Among the groups who were encouraged to feel these specific cultural grievances, that sense of nostalgic loss or exclusion support for Donald Trump increased by approximately 10 percentage points compared to the control group.
A 10-point swing.
Yeah.
Just by priming feelings of nostalgia or exclusion, that confirms that cultural anxiety is a powerful causal mechanism. It connects the economic shock to support for right-wing populism. It shows that the feeling of losing cultural ground is politically actionable.
And this is why compensatory policies that only focus on the economics, unemployment benefits, retraining programs, this is why they often fail to satisfy the populist voter.
Because they address the material shock, the dislocation.
Right, but they do nothing to address the cultural grievance, the nostalgic loss, or the status anxiety that's been activated. The problem is no longer just financial, it's become existential.
And we see that the political response is often driven less by material interests and more by this perceived loss of social standing or group identity.
Absolutely. Research on the 2016 U.S. election found that a perceived loss of group standing among historically high-status Americans, often white, non-college educated voters, was a stronger predictor of support for Donald Trump than that person's individual economic hardship.
So economic changes, like the massive shock from competition with China.
It heightens pre-existing xenophobic beliefs, and those beliefs then increase support for the populist right. This suggests the pathway of economic dislocation shaping culture and identity. What researchers call Channel B often trumps the channel of direct economic demand, or Channel A?
So it's the emotional reaction to being left behind or having your identity questioned, not just the loss of the paycheck, that dictates the vote.
Precisely. We know, for example, that voters who switched from Obama in 2012 to Trump in 2016 exhibited greater economic insecurity, yes, but also significantly greater racial hostility and negative attitudes towards trade and immigration. The two are deeply intertwined.
And when you put all of that into the statistical models,
the economic insecurity measure often loses its statistical significance, while the attitudinal and cultural proxies for globalization backlash retain their high predictive power.
This research suggests people aren't voting based on a cold, rational calculation of their financial well-being.
And it leads us to a critical finding. This cultural aversion can even override purely utilitarian economic logic.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Utilitarian economic calculus suggests people should always act to maximize their own financial benefit. If you're facing job loss due to imports, a purely rational actor would restrict imports from the most competitive nation to maximize the benefit to the domestic economy.
But the research on hypothetical factory closures showed something different when people were asked about the government's response.
It did. Respondents were asked how the government should respond to job loss, with options from financial aid to import protection. When the factory closure was blamed on outsourcing to a rich nation like France, the demand for import protection went up significantly. But when the same closure was blamed on outsourcing to a poor nation like Cambodia, the demand for protection quadrupled compared to a technology or domestic shock.
From a purely economic, utilitarian perspective, they should be more willing to restrict imports from a rich nation like France, which represents tougher competition. But they were way more likely to target the poor nation.
This much stronger protectionist response against Cambodia suggests that a cultural differences perspective is dominant. The American respondents viewed people from the developing nation as less like us and less worthy of sympathy or inclusion in the global trading system,
resulting in a far greater willingness to penalize them.
Yes. This cultural aversion, which was magnified among those who already supported Trump, completely dominated any utilitarian economic calculus. It's not about the wealth lost, it's about the identity of the perceived culprit. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the supply side. If the demand side, the voters, are exhibiting these culturally charged grievances, how do political actors and parties capture them and use them to gain power?
Well, when economic change produces these deep cultural grievances, that profound sense of nostalgic loss, compensatory policies like retraining or education subsidies, they just rarely satisfy the hope of recovering a familiar way of life or status. You can't retrain someone out of feeling excluded.
Exactly. And this failure to address the cultural loss leaves a political void, which researchers call the representational gap. Right-wing populist parties are uniquely positioned to fill this gap because they offer a promise of restoration.
Not reform.
No, restoration, rather than simply promising future progressive reform. They promise to undo the cultural changes that voters feel have marginalized them.
And they validate that grievance by embracing the rhetoric of the forgotten.
Correct. Populist right leaders style themselves as champions of the forgotten people. And this is a globally consistent phenomenon, whether it's Donald Trump invoking the forgotten men and women of America,
or Marine Le Pen in France, emphasizing that ordinary natives have been displaced by globalist elites and the bureaucracy in Brussels.
This rhetoric is highly effective because it acknowledges and redirects the grievance. It frames their mission as giving voice and power back to those who feel silenced by the cultural or political establishment.
It effectively points the finger at that cultural and political establishment, rather than at the complex, often opaque economic system globalization, automation that actually created the shock in the first place. It's an intentional redirection of anger.
And they actively cultivate this nostalgic longing. These movements present themselves as vehicles to make X great again, explicitly invoking a return to an imagined, often idealized past utopia.
Like Brexit slogans, "Take back control," or "We want our country back."
Those are explicitly urging voters to reclaim a supposedly better past, one free from transnational obligations and demographic change.
In contrast, left-wing parties typically ground their appeals in visions of a better progressive future, a future that is inherently different from the past. And by definition, that fails to satisfy this intense yearning for the past that's been amplified by these economic cultural shocks.
And that difference in rhetorical grounding is the crucial supply-side distinction. It leads us directly to the core mechanism, which researchers call Channel D. Economic shocks can induce political parties to deliberately inflame culture and identity to gain votes.
So they're amplifying latent divisions for electoral success, using the culture war as the engine of political mobilization.
That's it. And this political strategy works best when cultural threats and economic grievances reinforce one another, creating a narrative that hits both the wallet and the identity.
The political resonance is strongest when the narratives fuse together.
Trump's tariff proposals against China were a textbook example. They combined protectionist economics addressing the material shock with potent nationalist symbolism addressing the cultural grievance through the lens of global rivalry and American exceptionalism. They sold a product that appealed simultaneously to both the material and the emotional needs generated by the economic shock.
And we have powerful historical evidence that this strategy of priming cultural divisions to advance specific economic policies. It's not a new invention of the populist right. It's a tested method in U.S. politics.
That's a crucial insight for understanding the depth of this strategy. Studies show this strategy, Channel D, was extensively used by the Republican Party in the U.S. beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As economic inequality began to rise significantly, the party pursued a right-wing economic agenda tax cuts, deregulation that primarily benefited the wealthy.
So how do they sell that regressive economic platform to middle and lower middle class white voters who didn't necessarily benefit from tax cuts for the rich?
They adopted a racially charged narrative, the infamous Southern strategy.
Right.
They intentionally primed anti-Black prejudice using coded language and narratives around issues like law and order, opposition to busing, the stereotype of the welfare queen. These cultural appeals successfully drew in white working-class voters who felt culturally threatened by the civil rights movement and demographic change.
And that provided the necessary voting bloc to advance the party's elite-benefiting economic policies.
So the cultural war was, in part, a strategic packaging mechanism designed to sell otherwise unpopular economic policies to a key demographic.
Exactly. This historical account makes it clear that the American version of right-wing populism, this strategy of leveraging cultural anxiety, it predates the recent focus on trade and automation shocks.
It's a recurring strategy where leaders deliberately inflame culture and identity in response to economic dislocation to achieve specific political and economic ends. The political resonance of the 2025 NSS, with its focus on civilizational erasure and hard sovereignty, is the ultimate scaled-up expression of this domestic supply-side strategy now being deployed as official foreign policy. So what we've seen in this deep dive is how a complex structural economic problem, whether it's globalization, trade shocks, or the threat of automation, is transformed by these psychological pathways into a fundamental crisis of identity and cultural survival.
And the profound domestic political crisis that generated this NSS is now being projected onto the international stage.
Yes, treating our oldest European allies as if they are suffering from the same internal cultural fragmentation and demographic threat that is currently mobilizing the American populist right.
So what does this all mean for the world? The focus of American national security has shifted dramatically. It's moved from defending shared democratic values abroad, the foundation of the entire post-WWII consensus, to enforcing a specific, racially and culturally defined vision of Western civilization.
A definition explicitly influenced by narratives like the Great Replacement theory.
And this fundamentally changes the nature of international alliances. When a national security strategy calls for active intervention to cultivate patriotic European parties and actively resists European regulations on hate speech, it is explicitly prioritizing nationalist purity and demographic concerns over institutional cooperation.
The NSS effectively takes that domestic Channel D, the supply-side strategy of exploiting cultural grievances, and scales it up to become official foreign policy against our own partners.
This policy, by its very design, encourages the dissolution of established alliances like NATO, threatening to strip Article 5 protection from nations like Germany if they fail to meet an impossible 5% defense spending target.
It's less about defense readiness and more about engineering a diplomatic excuse to decouple from Europe and fulfill that promise of hard sovereignty.
The strategy risks triggering a major collision with allies who will inevitably resist direct political intervention in their internal affairs. European leaders, whether center-right or center-left, are unlikely to stand idly by while the U.S. actively works to orchestrate the downfall of their political establishments.
And this confrontation could potentially lead to the end of the very alliance system that secured the post-war peace and stability.
This deep dive shows that the central argument driving American foreign policy is no longer really about China or Russia. They are peripheral to this core doctrine. The argument instead is about who belongs in this narrow, culturally defined vision of Western civilization. The most dramatic, unsettling consequences of this domestic debate are now being felt globally, potentially dismantling the international order that the United States itself built.